And now we are moving to the last speaker, and it's the most difficult job on the panel actually, because it's a diversity of research areas, adopted theoretical approaches, and empirical findings. So good luck, Mark.
Thank you, Adam. Can you hear me? And of course, I will offer a grand synthesis that ties all these very diverse materials together. I'm very grateful to the opportunity to participate, of course. These are all wonderful papers in their very different ways. I think I'm going to focus on what it seems to me areas for improvement rather than on the wonderful qualities of these papers. And if I'm speaking too quickly, please remind me to slow down. These papers are mostly heavily empirical, I would say, close to the ground of the facts. Joachim's it has more theoretical aspirations that I'll discuss as well. First, Ivor's paper. This is a very promising line of research, and the combination of different methods, that is content analysis of the media with focus groups in particular, is very unusual, and as best I can tell. The conclusions of prior research on this question, mostly in Bosnia and Herzegovina, have been very pessimistic as to just how effective international criminal law can be in influencing popular collective shared memory of mass atrocities. And this research, at least the preliminary indications from the media analysis, suggest just that, again, consistent with the research by Lara Nettlefield and others. This conclusion, this pessimistic preliminary conclusion, is consistent with much of what we've heard over the last 2 days. That is, repeatedly we've learned about countries, situations where national politics, nationalism in particular, influences and limits the extent of the penetration of an international legal framework, a criminal interpretation of the events, and the acceptance of prosecutions in turn. So the news is not good from Croatia any more than from the other places that we've heard thus far, at least provisionally, despite the some progress on the trials themselves, of course. Second, the focus groups. I'm curious about the methodological strengths and weaknesses of this approach in comparison to other methods that are more commonly used to examine these issues. For instance, opinion surveys or ethnographies of the sort that Nettlefield undertook for some years, interviewing people all over the villages and in The Hague. There's a line of criticism of opinion survey research. Of course, I think the Frankfurt School was the first that introduced it, that focuses on how opinion surveys extricate people from their social context, their social milieu, that influences their views and atomizes them as they try to express their opinions. Now, focus groups, of course, involve a kind of social milieu. People are interacting with one another in a group, but of course, a focus group is a construction of the researcher, and these methods have been criticized as making the articulation of opinion subject to manipulation by the convener. So I'd be curious about hearing about the methodological defense of this. Third, Ivor writes there's been little cultural change in norms, and one wonders why, at least as best he can tell thus far from the early stage of the research. And according to what theories of norm construction would we expect or not expect norms to change in reaction to these kinds of judicial decisions and media coverage of them? Also, the difference between thematic versus episodic news framings, episodic meaning essentially the effort to separate particular events from the larger theme of the homeland war, the defense of the nation. I wonder whether that's not specific to this particular case study, but more generally the case that elite publications tend to offer more thematic treatments, in-depth analysis, in other words, whether it's accurate or biased, whereas popular press, the truly mass media, tend to offer more episodic treatments. And so that depending on whether you're looking at elite or mass publications, you'd find more or less episodic versus thematic. Okay, enough said. Magdalena I think we really need a lot more research of just this variety. There's certainly a great need for it. And Małgorzaty's new book is certainly apposite here, looking at the representations of the Holocaust in Polish and German cinema as well. Some reactions. I think you've given us a very rich descriptive account of the representations of the Third Reich imagery in the immediate post-war years. But I wonder what sort of theories of cultural representation might inform the analysis. What hypotheses, in other words, derived from such theories you might begin with and to bring to the analysis of these rich empirical materials, which would, of course, tell us about their larger significance, apart from the particular time and place where they were represented. And of course, also related to that, what theories of interpretation are you applying, or should want to think about applying to these sorts of materials? If I understand, it wasn't an entirely purely descriptive account. There were moments, as I'll get to in a second, where you were offering some interpretations, but it was heavily descriptive. And if there was an underlying theory, it wasn't clear to me. At least informing them. And alternative theories would be best to assess for their comparative strengths and weaknesses. Yes, the question of an implicit interpretive framework. You used the word satire and irony a lot. I found this curious. I'm not questioning the accuracy of this characterization, but satire, just tell me if you don't share this interpretation or the inferences I draw. Satire has always struck me as a kind of genre of writing or representation that entails a kind of mild mockery, not a severe moral condemnation, in other words. So, for instance, Charlie Chaplin's depiction of Adolf Hitler in The Great Dictator, a film made before the war, significantly, depicts Hitler in what's clearly a satiric frame of reference. Of course, after the war, you can't watch that film in quite the same way and naively or innocently adopt a merely satiric view of Hitler, because the impulse to condemn much more than the genre conventions of satire allow are very strong, and rightfully so. So the very use of satire, as opposed to a more overtly retributive or critical style of discourse, suggests implies to me potentially a kind of underestimating of what's at stake, the moral gravity of the actions of the person who's being satirized. Also, in that regard, some of your images depict Third Reich personnel, linking them to other kinds of current social pathologies, like poverty in particular. This seems to me, at least in first impression, just exactly what Joachim was telling us that the German African reporter wanted to avoid. In other words, this kind of neutral and relativizing or spreading of the imagery of the Third Reich to other kinds of issues besides the Holocaust. Now, I realize these images occur right after the war and before the Holocaust enters into global memory and German memory as powerfully as it does at the time when Joachim is interviewing this African official. Okay. Also, the reaction of the German villagers to the effort of U.S. occupation authorities to basically, if you will, rub their nose in the crimes of the Third Reich, visiting open graves and so forth. You could see that as an example of a much broader phenomena of resistance to official efforts of all sorts to influence collective memory. People just avert their eyes. They walk away. They don't show up. This, of course, is apparently the case in the South African experience, where I gather that people stopped watching the televised reports of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission after a few days. Okay. Now, Joachim, this is a very rich and really profound body of work which this paper draws. To my mind, in my opinion, this is really sociology at its best. It's truly comparative, covering several countries. There is a range of different kinds of sources and methods, both qualitative and quantitative, used with equal sensitivity and rigor, I think. The work invokes a rich range of scholarly debates and theoretical orientations. It deals with the issue, of course, of contemporary moral exigency, and the effort to study historical memory, to measure its impact in a methodologically rigorous way, as opposed to just the sort of speculation that people like me engage in, is very rare. In fact, I think perhaps unprecedented. That said, with regard to the variety of the theoretical orientations that Joachim draws on, I can't help but, what's appealing to this is, of course, the rejection of the classical, if you will, European, to my mind, view that each of these are standalone social theories, hold conceptions of the world, hold universes, social imaginaries from which we can't pick and choose little hypotheses, which is, of course, the very American view. We extract hypotheses from all these great thinkers. We don't take them as a whole, which of course they themselves claim they must be taken as a whole, accept it. So there's a very kind of American approach in this way that the most European social theorists that I'm familiar with would not accept. So much the worse, perhaps, for the Europeans. I don't know, that's another matter of debate. They would find this very eclectic. So I guess to put that as a question, to what extent do you think it is really defensible to extract these hypotheses from people as diverse as Bourdieu and Weber and John Mayer and so forth? What's another interesting thing about this is how it reverses the usual dependent and independent variable relationship. That is, it takes cultural representations as the dependent variable and makes into the independent variable national level factors that determine memories of the past. That's a reversal of the way things are normally done, and Ivor's paper is more like the way things are normally done, in that normally we look at how media or legal representations affect or influence memories of the past, not vice versa. So it's novel in that way as well. One term that you use periodically that I found both compelling and vexing at the same time, you refer a lot to cultural sensitivities. This is a concept that seems to be very important to the argument. It's, I think, very elusive conceptually, just what that means, and much less how to operationalize it empirically. You do so, as I gather, most effectively through some of these interviews where the Irish, or especially the German Africa reporter, talks about the sensitivities of the German readership if the Holocaust isn't associated. And so too with the Irish humanitarian aid or diplomat. Okay. Next, is it possible to consider alternative hypotheses to explain the same data? When I studied Introduction to Sociology, I was always insisted upon me that you can do good research by saying, here's some data, here's a theory that explains it, or a combination of theories. But the best scholarship, I was told, always involves, well, here's the data, and here's 2 or 3 different theoretical traditions that might explain it, or explain parts of it with greater strength. So it seems to me I'd want to hear a contrary view that's strikingly different, if it exists, and see it refuted. And then finally, or almost finally, I'm puzzled by the German reaction, the rejection of the crime framing of events on the grounds that it would entail a relativization of the Holocaust, and so that the word genocide, therefore, is not used to describe the Darfur events on that ground. As a lawyer, this leads me to, I'm led to react by saying, this just shows how little legal categories, strictly speaking, really influence any of these media representations, because it would be very easy for the German press or any other press to depict the events of Darfur in terms of international crime. Not the crime of genocide, necessarily, but the crime of war crimes, or varieties of war crimes, varieties of crimes against humanity, equally international crimes. And yet, that alternative formulation as crime, international crime, but not genocide, does not seem to be employed at all, as best I can tell, even though it would be what we international lawyers would like to see promoted. That these are important wrongs as well, and that shouldn't be diminished. We shouldn't stop thinking about the events of Darfur as international crimes just because it may not be genocide. And then finally, I wonder about the larger theoretical significance of your empirical findings, Joachim, for competing theories of media framing and the sociology of the media in particular, rather than just the larger grand theoretical traditions of Bourdieu and such. There's a more focused, specialized body of research going at least back as far as Michael Schutzen's early works and Todd Getlin's, and of course post-structuralist analyses of the media that look at how news events get framed and their various influences on that framing that you don't seem to be interested in exploring here, at least in this short version of your larger project that you've shared with us. So then thank you very much for all of these three wonderful presentations. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to comment on them. Thank you.